Hi, my name is William Breeze, and today I'm going to talk to you about an author and an interview. The author is Henry Neff, creator of the Tapestry series, whose books I have been reading. I began my correspondence with Henry the spring of 2012, and, after some emails between us, we met just last fall. We talked about my writing and his, and I interviewed him about his books. That interview is what I'm bringing to you today, as well as a book talk which Henry gave just afterwards. Enjoy! Hi, I'm William Breeze, and today I'm going to be interviewing the author Henry Neff. He wrote the Tapestry series.
Very happy to be here, Will, and looking forward to answering your questions.
Okay. So we're in Montclair, New Jersey at the Comfort Food Kitchen. So you asked a question on Facebook about favorite mythical or imaginary creature. Do you have a favorite?
Oh boy. I don't know if I've got one favorite. I definitely remember when I was growing up reading the labors of Heracles and reading about the Chimera and the idea of this big serpent that if you cut off its head, two more grew. That definitely made a big impression on me. So if I had to pick one, I'd say that's probably the one that when I was growing up, the one I enjoyed the most.
So if you could be a character in the series other than Max, the main character, who do you think you would choose?
Oh boy. You know, Hannah's pretty tempting. Hannah, for people who aren't aware, Hannah is a goose. She's very saucy, pretty fun character. But you know, I don't know. I mean, if I were looking across them, I mean, in terms of a character, I think sometimes when we look at characters in books, there are characters that you admire the most, and then characters that you might like to be because they have a nice life. And in terms of characters I would like to be because I think they have a nice life and all of that, you know, maybe somebody like Hannah, maybe somebody like Yaya, somebody who their role is really looking after and caring after people, and they're not in as much danger as characters like Max or David or Elias Brahm or Cooper or characters like that are. So it's probably somebody like that. If I had to pick a character to be, if I had to pick a character I admire the most, you know, Cooper is a fun character. I like Cooper a lot. He's a big fan favorite.
Okay. So what mythology type, in the story you focus a lot on Celtic, what mythology type other than Celtic is your favorite?
Probably Norse. So I loved a lot of those different stories. So my parents were art historians, and so I got a lot of good and fun exposure to different kinds of stories when I was growing up. But I would say the Norse myths and the Irish myths really resonated a lot with me. I enjoyed the Greek myths and Egyptian myths and things like that too, but Norse, I mean, there's some great stories with Loki and Thor and Odin and all of those different characters and all the stuff. And I really love the idea that, you know, the gods had their place, but the gods had legitimate rivals in the giants, right, who lived in Jotunheim. And I really enjoyed some of that stuff too.
How do you think your story would have differed if you had written it with a focus on that mythology?
A Norse mythology? Well, Norse mythology definitely plays a role. So Irish mythology is predominant in the series because of Max's ties to Cuchulainn and the fact that they visit the Sidhe and things like that. But Norse mythology definitely has a role. So if you remember the Vergar brothers in the third book, and then the ship that Max negotiates for, I mean, that's very closely tied to Norse mythology. And then Elias Brahm and David are closely tied with the story of the Fenris Wolf, which is a big thing in Norse mythology. So, you know, I guess if it was going to play a bigger role, you know, maybe Max would have a tie to one of the Norse gods or things like that. But, you know, the Egyptian mythologies are reflected in the Book of Thoth. You know, we've got references to Greek mythologies and lots of the different creatures. We even have things like Japanese and Chinese mythology with Yaya, right, who is a Kirin. So I'd like to think of the tapestry as blending a lot of different things together, but Irish mythology certainly plays the biggest role.
So if you could be a deity from any myth or legend, what would it be?
Wow. A deity? Well, definitely not Odin, because he only has one eye. It might be, you know who is an interesting one? I always, Thor was always fun, and you always admired him, but he was kind of a hothead in the old stories. And I guess they make him that way in the movies that are coming out now. Boy, Apollo was kind of an interesting, because he was sort of the god of a lot of different things, so he was kind of fun. I'd say maybe somebody like an Apollo. Lu actually is an interesting deity. If you read some of the old Irish myths, actually in a lot of cases, they actually consider Lu to be sort of the Celtic Apollo. So there are a lot of ties between those two. So, they sort of looked over had a lot of different spheres of influence, were important within their pantheon, but not necessarily the head of the pantheon. It's probably one of those two.
I've heard you're beginning a new series. Can you tell us what it will be about?
It's not official yet, so there's nothing too official right now. But I've been kicking around a lot of different ideas for different projects that I could get interested in, and so some of them are, potentially things like I've thought about writing screenplays, thought about writing, sort of a novel for adults. Even I've thought about doing things for younger kids. So lots of different projects, but the one that I'm the most excited about right now would be a series. It would be tied to the world of the Tapestry, but somebody would not have to have read the Tapestry to enjoy it. But it would take place about 2,000 years in the future, where Rowan is actually an empire in decline, ruled by the descendants of Mina. And so there's a lot of stuff that I've been developing around that. So we'll see, So right now we're at the stage where we're starting to share it with different people who might be interested in putting it out there, and hopefully somebody will be interested in publishing it.
So how do you think Madame Petra, for those of you who don't know, she's a smuggler in the story, how do you think she, as a character, adds to the story?
I put Madame Petra in the book for a very specific reason. And I wanted us to get exposure to a human who had been successful in the world after Astaroth's rise to power. And somebody who is ruthless, but also in some ways sympathetic. You kind of understand how and why she became the way she is. And, it's because a lot of times in the books, we really see things through Max's worldview. And we see things from Rowan's point of view. And it was fun to create a character who did not like Rowan, right? Felt like she feels like Rowan really left them hanging, right, when things were really getting bad. And so I wanted us to see an example of a human who was existing, scrabbling, scratching for survival in this new world, and what somebody like that might be like. So she goes to parties with demons. She is a guest. She is taking advantage of other humans on Piter's Folly, right? And all of these different things. And I wanted us to get a sense of what somebody like that might be like.
Where did you get the idea for dreadnoughts and pin legs?
Oh, dreadnoughts and pin legs. So I wanted the idea of, one of the things that bothers me, one of my big pet peeves in fantasy series, is when people create a power that is so powerful that if you really think about it, it renders all logic in the story kind of nonsensical. And to me, teleportation is one of those powers, right? If somebody could really teleport and just appear and disappear somewhere else, that is such a powerful thing that if everybody could do it, it really would change. It's very difficult to have a lot of cohesion in your story if people can do that. And so when I was thinking about what Prusius was doing and what the workshop was doing, was that they figured out a loophole around that, right? So the idea that you could have these little scuttling things getting close and then instantly summon these enormous, right, sort of destroy everything in the area creations. And so my goal for that for having these things was, first off, I thought they were just cool, right? So I like the idea of these hybrid creatures that were part organic, part mechanical, part demonic, right? I like the idea and the logic behind using summoning as a way around the energy requirements of teleportation in the world that I created. And then I also like the idea of creating them to underscore the dangers that an organization like the Workshop poses. So they create and invent these really amazing things, but as we see, right, they get turned upon them, right? And so I think a lot of times when you have a big technological advance, oftentimes you have to be really careful, who is controlling that, into whose hands those things fall. And so, for me, it was an opportunity to create some cool new things, further flesh out the world and the logic of the world that I was trying to do, and also create a cool device for Max and David to save the day at the end of the book.
So who was your favorite author growing up?
Boy, if I had to, definitely different ones. It's hard for me to always pick one because for me, books are like different kinds of meals, right? So I might have a favorite kind of dessert or a favorite kind of entree or a favorite kind of pasta or whatever it is. Some of my favorites growing up, J.R.R. Tolkien was a big one. I'm a huge Tolkien geek. And so, I've probably read The Lord of the Rings, 30 times in my life. I've really just loved that, and so many people who work in the genre that I work in today owe so much of what they do to Tolkien. So I loved Tolkien. I loved Frank Herbert, who was the author of a series called Dune. So people who read Dune, there's a lot of times people compare my series to Harry Potter, but actually, if you read the whole series, the better comparison is probably Dune. Because Dune combines things that are old and new, different warring factions and things like that. I would say I'm certainly more interested in writing something that approximates that. So Frank Herbert is somebody I enjoyed. Ursula Le Guin, I think, writes magic very, very well. I think she's a really lyrical writer. So I would say some of those. And then also, for people who know the series well, a lot of them might know that, Max is named for Max from Where the Wild Things Are. So even authors like Maurice Sendak and picture book and children's book authors were a big inspiration to me.
So which part of a story is the most difficult to write for you? Like the beginning, middle, and...
Always the beginning. I really think the beginning, especially in a series. So it sounds like you're working on a series, and one of the things that you're going to find is that you have to strike a balance between... You have to get clever, because you have to figure out, how do I get the story going and introduce people to what's going on and some of the characters without rehashing everything that has happened in all of the previous books. And so you're really trying to strike a balancing act. And I think these days, people's attention spans are getting shorter. So, with iPods and iPads and everything else that's going on, people just don't have the patience to invest in stories like they did, when books were really the primary form of entertainment. And so you have to hook people quickly. And so I really think that a good, strong beginning to your story, it makes everything easier. It's really almost like setting up dominoes and having that perfect first domino that's going to get everything else to flow from it. So I would say the beginning is always the most difficult, at least for me.
So this is kind of a follow-up. Which character or specific scene is the most difficult to draw for you?
Oh, to draw. So for the illustrations in the book? I try to be discriminating when I do the illustrations. So I want to... There are two different types of illustrations. So the chapter illustrations, the ones that begin each chapter, those are almost like a little sampler from the chapter. So I want to create some interesting visuals that get somebody's interest piqued so that they want to find out what's going to happen in the chapter. The big illustrations, the plates that are scattered throughout the book, those are illustrations of scenes. And I want to be careful with those. So I want to scatter them throughout the book. I want them to be a lot of fun, but I also never, ever want to illustrate a truly climactic moment in the book, because I always want my readers to use their imaginations for those kinds of things. So I never want to dictate when you read that scene, how you interpret that. But that said, thinking about certain drawings that were the most challenging or the most difficult for me, I would say just technically, since I use really old techniques, a lot of artists these days use computer for a lot of stuff. I don't, so I use really old kind of turn of the century techniques. So sometimes when you have a lot of perspective, or things like that. So trying to make things go back into space realistically, that can take a long time. So I don't know if you remember the drawing of the archives from the second book. That was a lot of perspective lines, just me hunched over, listening to an audiobook and doing that for a long, long time. I would say the drawing in this book of, if you remember the drawing of Lacheus Diaboli, where they're interrogating Rolf's body, that was a technically challenging drawing. So things like that, things where there's a lot of technical stuff going on, I would say, because if I make a mistake with pen and ink, it's back to the drawing board. There's no fixing that. So those ones I kind of hold my breath and hope for the best.
Okay, so finally, can you give us any hints about the Red Winter?
Oh, so the Red Winters. So the Red Winter is going to be book number 5, and this is going to wrap up the series. And yeah, I can give some hints. So, for me, there are 3 big love stories. Funny enough, a lot of people probably don't think of love stories when they think of the Tapestry, but for me, there are kind of 3, maybe even 4 big love stories in the series. There is Bob and Mum. There is Max and Scatha. There is Cooper and Miss Boone. And in some ways, there's also Elias Brom, right, and Bridget, his wife. And so some of those things, we have to bring those things to a resolution. We have to, and in some ways, I would say the storyline for the Red Winter, I guess to some extent, is similar to the Lord of the Rings in the final book, where you essentially have one army trying to battle another army. So we have Rowan trying to battle Prusias and Prusias's forces, but then you have a side quest where you have Brom trying to get the book back from Astaroth. And then we have a third big storyline in this book, which is Max's identity, Max's fate, how Max is evolving. Max is continually evolving, really, from a mortal boy to an immortal god. And his identity, how that's shifting, and then we can't forget that the Atropos, right, are constantly hunting after him. So those are the 3 big storylines that we have in it. And it's a tricky thing to write because, I'm very attached to all of these characters, but ultimately you have to, you got to wrap it up, and you got to bring your story to a close. So I'm trying to explore all of these storylines while bringing things to a satisfying close to readers. And I'm also really trying to stay true to the tone and tenor of the books. As a writer, I try to be attached to my characters, but I try not to be so attached to my characters that I let it influence the way I think the story would really unfold. So people who are familiar with the series know that, some characters die and things like that. And I really try to force myself to tell the story in an honest way. And that can be a difficult thing to do.
So Henry Neff's new book is The Maelstrom, just came out, and his series is The Tapestry. Anything you'd like to say?
Well, I just want to thank you for taking the time to come out and spend some time with me and ask these questions. And also, I just want to encourage you and anybody else who sees this video, you are a very fine writer. And for somebody like myself who does this for a living, it is both inspiring and a little intimidating to see a young person with as much talent as you have who is so interested in creating books. And, one of the biggest things that I've learned going through this process is you just have to have the courage to get out there and do it. And I just got an email recently from a reader of my series who's a big fan, who is, I think, 16, and he is just having his first book published soon. So I look forward to reading your work and hope that you'll keep me in the loop on that, and just really appreciate you spending some time with me and reading Max's adventure. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me out here today. This is great for me for a couple of reasons. So one is one of my favorite things to do, I used to be a teacher out in California before I moved out to New York. One of my favorite things to do is to go around and spend time with young people, talk about reading, talk about writing. I also illustrate my books, so we also talk about art. And so that's always fun for me to do. It's a lot of fun for me to come out and talk about my series after a book has come out. and hopefully give you a little bit of insight into the process that goes behind it. And the final thing is that, my family and I, we just moved out to Montclair a couple of months ago from Brooklyn. And so it's really a treat for me to come out and spend some time with people in the community, get to know kind of the book scene out here, and it's really an amazing, it's kind of an amazing place. It really seems like there are a lot of writers, a lot of artists, and a lot of young people out here who are really interested in books, which in this sort of digital and electronic age is a really great thing to hear. So it's great to be out here. I try, when I do events, to keep things really interactive, right? And so what I'm hoping that we're going to do is really, use this opportunity to have a discussion about books, talk about things that you're into. We'll talk about some of my process behind the creative stuff. So I want you to feel comfortable about participating and interacting. So hopefully I'm going to ask some questions, and hopefully you guys are going to feel comfortable enough to dive just right in. So one of the things I wanted to dive into right off the bat is, how many of you would say that you have a favorite book or some book that you've read throughout your life maybe more than 3 times? And just raise your hand. I mean, it could be a novel, but it could also be a picture book. It could be, a favorite storybook, whatever it is. How many of you have a book that you read more than 5 times? More than 10 times? Well, I want you to picture one of those books, one of those really favorite books. I want you to think about what was something that made the book great. And share it with us if you can. So think about something that made a book really good, and what was something that made that book really exciting for you? What's one thing? Zombies. Okay, so from zombies, I'm going to take from zombies, I'm going to say, something that is scary. How many of you guys sometimes like to be scared when you read a book? That's kind of a funny thing, right? Sometimes we like to get kind of goosebumps or get a little bit frightened when we're reading a book. What's another thing that makes a book really great? Yes. Violence or action. So we've got zombies and we've got violence. So we could have action, a lot of action in a book. How many of you guys like to have action in a book? What's another one? Yeah. Memorable characters. I'm so glad to hear you say that, because I really believe when it comes to characters, if a book has great characters, I might go back and read it again and again and again. But if it has a really neat story, but not such great characters, I'll probably read it once, and I'll probably never go back to it. So, great characters. Yeah.
Funny.
Funny. How many of you guys have ever laughed out loud reading a book? Well, that's kind of an amazing thing when you really think about it, right? You got ink on a page that was printed maybe even hundreds of years ago, written by somebody who's maybe not even alive anymore, and it still has the power to make you laugh out loud. To me, that's kind of an amazing thing. When I wanted to write my books, and I'll give you a little bit of an overview, I really wanted there to be some of those components that you guys just talked about. So I don't know if they're zombies yet, but there are a lot of monsters in my stories. But there's a lot of action. There's also a lot of humor, right? Because I really wanted to create stories that wove a lot of these different things together, right? And the series is called The Tapestry. Can anybody here tell me what a tapestry is? What is a tapestry? Yes?
It is like a painting.
Okay, so it's an artwork,
Yes.
Absolutely. Is it painted or is it woven together?
Yeah, it's woven together with yarn.
Woven together, right, with different, so it's a textile. And where do we find tapestries?
In our museum.
Maybe in art museums, or where else can we find a tapestry? In an old castle, right? And tapestries served a couple of different purposes. One, they were really pretty to look at. Another, they kept castles, which were really cold. They kept them warmer. And then the third thing is oftentimes they told stories about the particular culture that they represented. And so when I was creating my story, my tapestry, I wanted to weave together lots of different kinds of stories. So things like fantasy, so elements of magic, but I also wanted there to be science fiction. I wanted there to be history. I used to be a history teacher. So I wanted there to be all kinds of different things that were coming together to make my stories. Now, how many of you guys have read some of the Tapestry books? Okay, so we've got some hands in here. How many of you guys have not yet read some of the Tapestry books? Okay, so we've got a couple other hands too. Well, if you're not familiar with the series is going to be 5 books. It was originally planned out to be 3, but it's kind of grown over time because the story got bigger and bigger. And in the first book, we've got a main character. His name is Max McDaniels. And Max McDaniels is going to be traveling to a museum with his dad. And while he's on that journey, he's going to find a secret tapestry in a secret room. And when he finds this, it's going to trigger a series of events that put Max at the center of a very old and secret war that's been going on between forces that want to control mankind and humans that have been gifted with magic that try to protect mankind. And so Max is going to go off to a secret school called Rowan Academy, where people like him have been trained to take place and defend people from this war. The second book is called The Second Siege. And The Second Siege is really, it's a race. It's a race between Max and his roommate David Menlo, who's a very powerful sorcerer, and a demon named Astaroth to try to get their hands on an Egyptian book that gives you the ability to control the past, the present, or the future. And so in The Second Siege, it's really a race between these guys to try to get control of this book. The third book is called The Fiend and the Forge, and this was really a lot of fun for me to write because it asks kind of a scary question. And the question that it asks is, what would you do if monsters ruled the world? What would you do if the cities and the governments and the countries that we knew no longer really existed, and now the world was divided up into different kingdoms or duchies or baronies that are ruled by different creatures or monsters, and humans are trying to kind of scratch and claw their place for survival in a world where they're no longer on the top of the food chain. And the fourth book, this is the one that just came out, I guess a couple of weeks ago, and it's called The Maelstrom. The Maelstrom is my personal favorite in the series, for a couple of reasons. We'll talk about what some of those are, but The Maelstrom is really, it's an interesting story for me because in The Maelstrom, Rowan, which is now no longer so much a little school of magic as it is an independent country trying to survive in this new world, Rowan is given an ultimatum by a demon king named Prusias to surrender certain things or they're going to come under attack, because Prusias wants to take over all the different kingdoms and all the different duchies around the world. And so in this book, there's a lot of my background as a history teacher in this book. Now that premise that I just gave you guys, it really sounds a lot like, well, that's a lot of fantasy. So you have this independent country, you have these demon kingdoms that want to take control. But actually, when I was teaching history, I was teaching American history out at a high school in California. And one of my favorite chapters of American history is when the United States, you know, it fights for its independence against the British Empire, against Britain, and it gets its independence. But then it's a little bit of, be careful what you wish for. You were being protected for a long time by the very powerful British Navy. You are now a very tiny independent country that is now, it's open season on you and your trade, and you have to kind of find your way in the big scary world. And in many ways, that's Rowan's dilemma in The Maelstrom. They're a small independent country. They are now, right, they fought hard for their independence, they negotiated treaties, and now they have to find their way in this big and scary world and find their independence. And so that's the dilemma that they're finding. Now, Prusias, this demon in this story, has given them a certain date by which Rowan has to decide whether they're going to capitulate, whether they're going to surrender some of these things, or if they're going to fall into line. And rumor has it that Prusias has a secret weapon that is giving him the ability to quash or crush and squash any other kingdoms that are putting up resistance. So in this story, Max McDaniels, he's going to go off with his roommate David, and they're going to try to find out what this secret weapon is, and hopefully sabotage, figure out what it is, try to give Rowan a leg up before things get really, really ugly. And so I'm just going to read a tiny little snippet from the story to give you a little sense of how I write, how I try to use words, some of my goals as a writer. We're going to talk about some of those a little bit, and then we're also going to talk about artwork, because I also illustrate my books, and then hopefully we're going to take some questions and talk about some of the things that you guys are doing. So in this scene that I'm going to read from, and it's just going to be about a page or two, Max and David have been working very hard to infiltrate a smuggler's home. And this smuggler lives in a settlement of humans called Piter's Folly, which is in the middle of what used to be Europe, if Europe still existed. And they're infiltrating this smuggler because they believe this smuggler has close ties with the Workshop, which is a technological society that has perhaps supplied Crucius with this secret weapon that they're trying to find. And so what they've done is they are disguised, magically disguised, as goblins, because the goblins traffic with this smuggler, and so they've just been admitted into the smuggler's office. Max and David trailed after Toby into a paneled office, whose far wall was lined with enormous windows that provided a panoramic view of the misty lake. Huge artworks dominated the other walls, abstract spatters of luminescent paint on black or red canvases. To the left was a long conference table. To the right, a comfortable sitting area where Katerina was pouting by a colossal fireplace. Straight ahead was a small desk. Behind it stood the smuggler. Madame Petra was the most striking woman Max had ever seen. She was younger than he'd imagined, mid-30s, with porcelain white skin and long auburn hair that fell in a braid to her waist. Her understated dress was in marked contrast to her ostentatious house. A simple black jacket, gray tweed pants, and black riding boots. She wore only one piece of jewelry, a diamond choker whose central stone must have been worth half of Piter's Folly. Offering a polite smile, she gestured to 3 chairs across her desk, before returning her attention to several documents. When Max and the others were seated, Dmitri pulled up a fourth. "We will not be needing you, Dmitri," said Madame Petra, offhandedly, jotting something on the top paper. "Katerina will sit in for today." "My lady," said the secretary, holding up his hand, "it is merely goblins. No doubt it would be better for Katerina to sit in with the Baron of Moravia. That would be more education." The smuggler glanced up sharply from her papers with eyes that flashed like emeralds. The man fell silent at once. When Madame Petra spoke, her voice was dangerously soft. "As you say, we have several Broadbrims with us this morning. I value their clan greatly and am anxious to hear their proposal. And we must disagree. I think Katerina has much to learn from this meeting. For example, she's already seen you break a cardinal rule of our profession and compromise another client's identity. Did you intend to impart such a clumsy lesson, Dmitri?" The man turned ashen. It was clear that he craved Madame Petra's approval on many levels. I apologize," he stammered. "With your permission, I'll take my leave." "Very good," said Madame Petra coolly. "Please tell the chefs that I'd like supper to be ready by 8. And no more fatty meats and pastries or boiling everything together. Delicacy, elegance, subtlety. I know they object to Nestor, but ask him to lend a hand. I think he trained as a saucier. It's my baby, so it's okay." Once the chastened secretary closed the door, Madame Petra turned to her daughter. "Katerina, come and sit by me. I'm fine over here. Goblins stink." "I imagine they say the same of you. Come over here, I want your help." At this, Katerina dragged herself up from the chaise and came to sit on her mother's lap. She was too old for such things, 11 or 12, but the girl seemed an unusual combination of old and young, absent and present. "How am I supposed to help?" she asked, blankly surrendering her cheek for a kiss. "Well," said Madame Petra, "we have a problem, and I know you like to solve problems." The girl nodded. Max glanced uneasily at David and Toby, but the two kept their attention on their hostess. "Here's our dilemma," continued Madame Petra. "The kingdom is at war. Ammon's armies are rampaging across the land, and here comes an unguarded, solitary goblin wagon braving the Ravenswood spur with a pittance of goods and asking for a private audience. Mind you, the Broadbrims haven't even sent anyone senior to conduct their business. Just a junior trader and 2 others I've never met before. Now they must have known I'd have their heads for such appalling insolence. And yet here they are. Why haven't I taken their heads, sweet daughter?" The girl frowned and stared at the 3 visitors. "They're either crazy or something's off," she murmured. "Maybe they're acting without their leader's approval. Maybe they've secretly brought something that we would find valuable, something they didn't want Dmitri to know about. And of course, they might not be goblins at all. Perhaps they're imposters." And so we have this scene, reader of the tapestry. He's working on his own books. William Breeze right here is working on his own books. I have a reader, T.J. Carson, who is, I believe, 16 years old, and his book is being published, I think, this month, right? And so to me, as somebody who not only likes to write and create these books, but also really likes to mentor young people and is a former teacher, I think that's one of the most amazing things. And one of my favorite things to do is try to deliver a message to young people that there is no reason in the world why you can't be working on your own books, and there's no reason in the world why you can't be illustrating your own books. I think there's a big misconception that you need a lot of fancy tools. And one of the things I want to do today is send the message that you don't. So I have a notebook, so if you guys come hang out with me in Montclair, you'll find me a lot of times hanging out at the coffee house, right, drinking way too much coffee, as you can see right now, and working in my notebook, right, jotting down ideas, getting stuff down, ideas about characters, ideas about the story, ideas about the world I want to try to create. And you'll also find me drawing. And the tools I use for drawing are really old school. So I use nothing more complicated than a pencil. These are sketches, and I'm going to pass them around so you guys can see them. So just do me a favor and be careful with them, because these are all original art. So these are pencil sketches that I do for chapter drawings. And these are just pencil on printed out computer paper. And then I brought in a couple of original drawings. Some of these I think appear in book. I think all of these are from book 2. And have you guys ever seen those old-fashioned dip pens?
Yeah.
What do you dip them into? Ink, into a bottle of ink. And so when I'm doing the drawings, I really like using that technique for illustration for a couple of reasons. One, I think it just happens to look nice. I like the look and feel of those. 2, they reproduce well. So they reproduce really well onto the page. And 3, I really think from an artistic standpoint, I think illustration was really amazing at the turn of the century, right at the turn of the 19th to the 20th century. These days, people use a ton of computer, and I think that absolutely has its place, and I really admire the people that do that well. But I think there's something really nice about having an actual piece of artwork that exists, right? And so I just use dip pens to do all the lines, and then I use a little brush to paint in the black areas, and then anywhere you see gray, I'm just watering it down, almost like watercolor, and painting in the grays to create the illustrations. So that's kind of the process that I use for writing and for drawing. Can I answer any questions about the stories, about the maelstrom, about the tapestry, about writing, about illustrating, any of that stuff? Because I want to give you guys a chance to get any questions that you have answered. Yes?
How do you take your ideas?
So one of the questions I just got was, how do I get my ideas? I get my ideas from all over the place. So one of the things, a big part is just from growing up. So if you guys have been reading the stories, do you know, what are the wolfish creatures called? They're called Vais, right? And Vais, if you're not familiar with the stories, Vais are shape-shifting wolfish creatures with squinty eyes, right? And if they talk to you, they can kind of charm you and beguile you, right? They don't like to attack from the front. They like to kind of get you to a point where you're vulnerable. And what else do we know about Vais? What do we always know? They're always look out for. Yeah? The second Vi. They always work in pairs. So if you see one Vi, you know there's another one nearby. Well, when I was a little kid growing up outside Chicago, I had an overactive imagination, as you can imagine. And I would have bad dreams. And I had these recurring bad dreams. And I was little, like not that much older than my son Charlie, maybe when I was 3 or 4. And I had these dreams of these big, they almost looked like wolves or dogs with squinty eyes that would chase after me in my dreams. And I ran into my parents' room and I said I had a bad dream. And I was all upset. They said, well, what's the matter? And I said, Vais are chasing me. I have no idea why I called them that. But I did. And it became a big joke in my family when we were growing up. It was like, oh, Henry, look out for the Vais. Right? Well, when I was writing the story, that is an idea that came to me when I was 3. I have ideas that have come to me from different experiences of my life. Ideas that have come to me from different books I've read that have inspired me. So, you might know if you read the stories that Max is named after Max from Where the Wild Things Are. Because I loved that book growing up. Because you've got this boy we know is mischievous, we know gets sent to his room without supper, we know that a forest grows, and this is one of my favorite lines in all of literature. An ocean tumbled by with a private boat for Max. And I think for the young writers here, I think that's a great illustration of the idea that you can write well and write beautifully and write lyrically without using big words. But Max, we know, sails off to this land, and what lives in the land? Monsters. Wild things. And they're giant, and they have teeth, and they have claws, and they have horns. But who's the wildest? Max. And that to me was the coolest idea in the world. So my ideas come from all over the place. Things that are going on in my life, things from when I was a tiny little boy, everywhere. Any other questions?
I have one that's not important.
Huh?
It is not important to the book at all.
That's okay.
Does David own a coffee machine?
So, now familiar with the story. So the question was, does David own a coffee machine? David is Max's roommate. He's a very powerful sorcerer. So Max is a very physical, action-oriented character. David is a much more cerebral, problem-solving character, very powerful magically, and one of his, I guess you could say, character quirks, character flaws, depending on how you want to look. He drinks a ton of coffee. And it's sort of an exasperation to all the librarians because he's always bringing coffee into the library, leaving coffee rings all over the place. Does he own a coffee machine? You can answer that question for me. Would he own a electric coffee machine?
No.
Why?
Because all the technology made it.
So all the technology has gone away. So he wouldn't own an electric coffee machine. He would certainly have a manual coffee grinder, right? And we know that he can heat the water himself using magic. So I would say he probably use a combination of those two things. Other questions about the books? Oh, Nigel, you have a question. No, okay, we'll get back to you. Questions about writing, about the stories, about the maelstrom, about inspiration, any of that stuff? Yes?
How do you know how to call the different names?
So how do I name different things? When you say different, you mean creatures or characters or anything. So how do I come up with names? I am not a fan of names that tell you exactly what the thing is. So for example, if the adults here, they have I was just talking about this with my wife this morning. If you've read Game of Thrones or heard about that series Game of Thrones, well, the leader of the Wildings, right, these barbarians that live beyond the wall, his name is Mance Rayder. And that drives me crazy, right? Because his name essentially means he's a person who raids or attacks houses, and they change the spelling a little bit. So I never want to do things like that. I don't like that. But I try to have names that do give a sense of what the character is, that are pleasing to the ear to say. So David Menlo, Menlo Park, Thomas Edison was called the Wizard of Menlo Park. And so Menlo to me has sort of an intellectual connotation to it, an intellectual sound to it. Max McDaniels, I like the alliteration of it. I like the sound of that. And also, as we know, Max has a tie to an Irish hero, Cahalan. So I want to give him an Irish surname. Elias Brahm. So for people who haven't read the stories, Elias Brahm is a very powerful sorcerer who is almost resurrected at the end of the third book and is going to play a very important role in the fourth and fifth books. You know, that sound to me just was such a powerful name, right? So things like that. So Rowan. Rowan, there's a very specific reason for why Rowan has its name. So Rowan is the school that Max and these others attend that evolves into kind of this independent country. And Rowan, in folklore, the Rowan tree had a very important sacred purpose. And so if you went into a peasant's home in the Middle Ages, they might have a bundle of rowan twigs tied above their door or even above windows. And the idea was that the rowan tree kept evil spirits away. And so if you were a superstitious person, you might have rowan at all the entry points to your house to keep evil spirits away. So it's a beautiful tree. It also has a very specific purpose in mythology and folklore. Any other questions about Max, about characters, about the setting, drawing? Oh, back there, yes.
How has folklore and mythology played?
So the question was, how has folklore and mythology played a role in the book? It's a good question. It's very important. I would say, when you think of all the different ingredients that go into the stories, folklore and mythology are one of the biggest ones. And so I'm really interested in building, what I really wanted to do, if you read the entire series, I was interested in changing the world that we knew, building a fantasy world on top of the foundations of the existing world, so that by the time you get to the fourth and fifth book, the world is almost unrecognizable from the one that we know. I mean, the opening scene of the first book is Max on a train going into Chicago. That's almost unimaginable by the time we get to the third, fourth, or fifth books. I wanted mythology and folklore to play an important role One, because I love those stories, and two, just the teacher in me loves sharing some of those things with my readers. And so, not a lot of people have had a ton of exposure to Irish mythology. So exposing them to heroes like Cuchulainn, or fairy worlds like the Sidhe, gods like Lugh, right? That was important to me. Egyptian mythology is in the book, the Book of Thoth, right? This book that gives you control of the past, present, and the future. I also wanted Norse mythology, Greek mythology, all these things to be in. One of the most amazing things to me as a reader, as somebody who's interested in human history, interested in any civilization in the history of mankind has its own stories of heroes and gods and monsters and how the world came to be. And one of the most interesting things I think I could do is try to not only stitch some of those traditions together, but also introduce younger people to some of those ideas. So mythology is certainly one of the foundations of the series. Yes?
In the chapter The Wanderer,
Uh-huh.
where it talks about Astaroth being much older, are those... Did you base that on like actual stories, or did you make that up?
I made that up. So Will's question was, there's a chapter in the fourth book called The Wanderer, where Elias Brahm, the sorcerer, starts sharing his theory that Astaroth, who's the main villain in the series, and Astaroth is actually a quote-unquote real demon from, in the 15th and 16th centuries, the church was creating all of these very detailed hierarchies of heaven. And they also created all these very detailed hierarchies of what they thought of hell. And so all of these dukes of hell and Astaroth and all these things. So Astaroth is actually a villain taken from some of these old manuscripts that were created in the 15th and 16th century. But one of the things I wanted to do in my story was add in the suggestion that actually maybe Astaroth isn't even really a demon. That he's something even much older and more alien, maybe not even from this universe, and has been masquerading as a demon for all of these centuries. And to me, that made it even scarier. So for one of the things I wanted to do, and I've actually had some interesting dialogue with readers on this, the third book, you actually get a lot of insight into quote-unquote demon culture. And I've had some readers write in and be like, oh, but aren't you worried about offending people or this or that? And I'm not so worried about that, because I didn't want the demons in my stories to just be kind of super monsters, and I also didn't want them to rigidly fall within Judeo-Christian theology, because even the word daemon comes from Greek, and it's an older concept of spirits, right? And I didn't want them just to be super monsters. I actually want them to have their own culture, right? And for there to be, I mean, of course, many of them are evil, but some of them are indifferent. Some of them are actually even good. I actually want to think of their personality almost like cats. They're not really moral or immoral. They sort of could be interested and kind to you if the mood strikes them, or they could be terribly, they could be terrifying. So, but I wanted the idea that Astaroth is the main villain in the series, is even older, maybe even stranger, and in the fifth book we're going to see a lot more about where he comes from and some of his story. Because one of the things that comes up in that chapter is the idea that, Astaroth appeared to pharaohs, and he appeared to Chinese emperors, and he was always very helpful. And then Elias Brahm actually even finds out from these very old records of shaman who were visited by this sort of strange, smiling man way back in the day who didn't seem to understand humans, but was slowly trying to kind of mimic or adopt some of their mannerisms, and it raises the idea that maybe even Astaroth is even stranger and more alien than we thought of. So I wanted to make him even something above and beyond the demons.